My name is Madison, and in this presentation, I will be discussing a few topics related to sex trafficking. Sex trafficking is a worldwide epidemic that exploits and taints the youth of children and young adults. Many people do not understand how widespread and significant the epidemic is, and that just about anyone can fall victim to it. To get this presentation started, I will discuss some important statistics of sex trafficking that shows just how real the problem is. About 2 million children are trafficked into the sex trade every year. There are three forms of trafficking. These are debt bondage, forced labor, and sex trafficking. Out of these three forms, about 22% of trafficking victims are those who are forced into the global commercial sex trade. Out of the 2 million trafficked into the sex trade, 96% of sex trafficking victims are female, whether it be children or grown women. Anyone can become a victim of sex trafficking, but victims of sex trafficking most commonly come from poor countries where they can be easily taken advantage of. Sri Lanka, Haiti, and Bangladesh are just a few of these countries. Sex traffickers see their work as a business and profit greatly from selling their victims for sex. The business of sex trafficking can be understood in a three-phase model. Phase 1 is acquisition. This is where the victim is initially brought into the sex trade. There are a few techniques in which sex traffickers bring victims into the sex trade, which will be discussed later on. Phase 2 is movement. In this phase, trafficking victims are transported from their country of origin to the country in which they will work or sold for profit. The countries in which they end up are known as destination countries. The last phase is exploitation, though exploitation occurs the minute they are acquired in the first place. In the exploitation phase, victims are fully immersed into the sex trade and suffer the many tortures that it brings. The majority of sex trafficking occurs in one of the following ways. Sex trafficking by deceit occurs when a victim is approached and given a false offer that would benefit their current standing, such as employment, migration, or marriage. This is a strong technique used in poor countries because the offers that are given by traffickers are almost impossible to refuse by the victims because they give them hope of a better life. Victims are also inclined to accept these offers so they can help to provide for their family. The second way in which a victim can emerge into the sex trade is if they are sold by their family. Families in impoverished countries with little job opportunities will do just about anything to put their food on the table. It is terrible, but this leads some families to sell their daughters to sex traffickers. The third way in which a victim can be brought into the sex trade is through abduction. This goes without saying, but abduction is when sex traffickers steal victims from their home and force them into the sex trade. The fourth way a victim can find themselves in the sex trade is through seduction. Seduction is when a sex trafficker or someone working for a sex trafficker uses romantic tactics on a victim to make them vulnerable, and then uses this vulnerability to either force them into the sex trade or make them think it is a good idea for them. In cases like these, victims develop an emotional relationship with their trafficker in which they feel obligated to do what the trafficker wants. The last form in which sex trafficking occurs is through recruitment by former slaves. In this case, slaves can recruit a new victim to free themselves, or they recruit victims, normally poor ones who are desperate, by telling of false benefits from being in the sex trade. In the second phase, victims are transported to the country in which they are acquired to the destination country through a variety of ways. Three of the most common ways to transport victims is by cargo ships, border crossings, and false passports. Cargo ships are used when a large number of sex trafficking victims are to be transported to their destination country at one time. Victims experience terrible conditions on these cargo ships. They are packed into extremely tight spaces with no food, water, or access to bathrooms. This can lead to conditions becoming extremely filthy. Trips can last from days to weeks, and during these trips, victims must literally live in their own dirt. Oftentimes, some victims fall ill and die. The rest of the victims must then continue the trip next to the dead victim. This leads to a vast amount of psychological damages for victims, and for many of them, the real torture has yet to begin. Another mode of movement is through border crossings. This is typically used when there is only a few victims to transport and the destination country can be accessed by driving. At border crossings, sex traffickers often bribe the guards to let them pass. The last common mode of movement is through the use of fake passports. In this technique, traffickers acquire fake passports so they can transport their victims to the destination country with ease. In business terms, the money lost in the first two phases to acquire and transport victims is more than made up for in the third phase. Upon arrival to their destination country, the real horror for sex trafficking victims begins. Their lives now consist of drugs, rape, torture, starvation, and humiliation. Victims are commonly given drugs such as opium to encourage them to have sex with clients. If they refuse, they are tortured, abused, starved, or publicly humiliated into being obedient. If they try to escape, they are killed. There are many different locations and ways in which sex trafficking victims are exploited. The first two are brothels and sex clubs. These are where victims are sold for sex to clients. A very common location for sex trafficking victims to be found is on the streets. In this case, victims roam the streets dressed a certain way that makes it obvious to passerbys that they may be prostitutes. All a person looking to buy sex must do is pick up the prostitute. The money the prostitute receives for selling themselves almost always goes to their sex trafficker in full. The most private locations are apartments and hotels. In these cases, sex traffickers set their victims up in these locations and have clients on hand to visit the locations to have sex with the victims. The payment normally goes straight into the hands of the sex trafficker rather than the victim. For sex slaves, enslavement is normally not a life sentence. If they live long enough, sex trafficking victims eventually outgrow their worth and are eventually let go of. For many, they are left in a place lower than they were before they were trafficked. After life as a sex slave, victims experience many difficulties. For one, many victims develop drug addictions during their time as a sex slave due to traffickers and clients constantly force-feeding them drugs to make them more compliant. In addition, the majority of victims contract STDs and even HIV due to unwanted and unprotected sex. Many victims are even deported back to their country of origin on illegal immigration charges, and some are even incarcerated for prostitution. Lastly, most likely every single victim suffers from psychological damages after their life as a sex slave. They relive the memories and torture they went through. Many of them develop PTSD, anxiety, depression, along with other illnesses. Although victims of sex trafficking are normally not slaves forever, after they are free, they are never free from their memories of the horror they went through.